All right. So we'll be taking the first session, which is on the question of God's existence. And I simply, sorry, it's a slide already. You can display the slide now. All right. So I simply pose the topic of my presentation in a propositional format. Simply, does God exist? And in trying to demonstrate whether or not in trying to demonstrate that he does exist, I use an argument from contingency. So it's one of the plethora of arguments that's usually utilized for the existence of God. And the existence of God is really a matter of an Victorian age-long debate, right? The fact that we've been debating the very matter of God's existence for centuries, and it would seem like it's an overflowed matter. But the very fact that we've been debating it since the Victorian age implies very strongly that it is a matter of quintessence. For if God does exist, then there is nothing more quintessential that we can discuss here today. If you could muster any thoughts that you think is of importance, it would not parallel the thoughts that God exists and the virtue in seeking the truth behind his existence. I once heard an analytic philosopher say, and he quantified this where he said that all of mankind there's a question mark behind all of mankind, and death is simply behind it. Whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we know it or not, we are constantly and continually contemplative of death every day. The question is, what happens? Whether you affirm naturalism, whether you affirm Christian theism, or you affirm really any other worldview, it is that at the very terminus of your worldview, the foundation is what happens when we do die. And I hope that in presenting my arguments, I would have been able to convince anybody who is not convinced about the existence of God. So first things first, I think next slide. So I think I saw this, we're arguing about this in an academic circle, right? About it's that knowledge that branches other disciplines by which we inquire stuff, whether it's astrophysics or physics or chemistry or medical treatment. There is a fundamental core that brings together all of these disciplines, without which none of these disciplines will be able to work. Whether we're inquiring about nature through physics and chemistry, or we're inquiring about sociological facts through the social sciences and humanities, there's something that fundamentally grounds all of this subject. And people speculated a lot on whether it is theology or whether it is philosophy. But of course, I think the answer is self-evident that it is philosophy. For without philosophy, we would not be able to have any of these disciplines in the first place. For without philosophy, we would not be able to utilize reason and logic to have meaning, to derive meanings out of things. For without philosophy, you would not even be able to understand the words that I speak to you. For there's a philosophy of astrophysics, there's a philosophy of physics, there's a philosophy of social sciences, there's also a philosophy of humanities, there's even a philosophy of international relations. So you could not have all of those. For those horses to be coherent, or for these disciplines to be coherent, they would have to be grounded by philosophy. And one of the things that necessitated a lot of debates concerning the arguments of God's existence in the 17th century, 18th century, even the 20th century, was that a couple of philosophers came together in Vienna, Austria, and they tried to ground a means through which we can know facts about our natural world. And one of the conclusions that they came to is known as verificationism or scientism. Verificationism or scientism. So verificationism or scientism, or simply scientism, means that all the facts or how we come to know things can be known through the modality of science. Or science is the means by which we acquaint ourselves with facts of the natural world and nothing else. all of knowledge, right? Whether we're talking about knowledge from the social sciences or humanities, if it's not repeatable, if it's not testable, if it cannot be observed by the scientific methods, then it should not be factored under the category by which you can know. So let's take, for instance, next slide, please. Let's take, for instance, Bertrand Russell, one of the most foremost foremost philosopher of the 20th century. He's agnostic, says that whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods. Now, keep in mind that he's not talking merely about natural knowledge or knowledge about natural facts. He's saying whatever knowledge is attainable, it must be attained by scientific methods. And what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. Or when we look at Sidney Hook, who is also a philosopher of pragmatism, when he said that naturalism wholeheartedly accepts scientific methods as the only reliable way of reaching truths about man, society, and nature. And this, because of the mere influence of these philosophers, the vestiges of their thoughts would seep into society, and we peddle these thoughts in as much as it's been responded to since the 20th century. And it is, of course, a self-evidently flawed way to ground knowledge about the natural world, or really about anything. And here are the few problems about scientism. And the first problem about scientism is that scientism simply does not demonstrate that those aspects exhaust nature. For there is nothing more to the natural world than what the method reveals by Fraser. So what Fraser is essentially saying is that even if we can use the scientific method to ground natural facts, it doesn't automatically follow that you can always use the scientific method to ground every natural fact. That's one of the criticisms that Fraser, who is a Thomistic philosopher, posits. And the second problem with scientism is that scientism is susceptible to the objection that scientism cannot be proven by science itself, therefore self-stultifying. So what that means is that to say that everything must be verified by science presupposes that even the statement itself has to be verified by science. Do we follow? So if we say, for instance, if I made the proposition that there is nothing that's really true, right? So one would then be forced to ask, or it begs the question, is that statement itself true? Right? Or when somebody says that we can never really know anything, or somebody who is from Crete or from the Crete Island, for instance, says that all Cretans are liars, it then necessitates that we have to ask the question, is that statement of itself a lie? So it means by definition, it is self-stultifying, it contradicts. And because it contradicts and it is incoherent, we would have to dismiss such thought. And truly, its advocates tether such proposition not merely on scientific, but chiefly on philosophical premises, which goes back to what I was saying in the earlier slide, that philosophy is what grounds all of our disciplines, no matter how far you think about it. And then the third problem with scientism is that science does not account for abstract concepts with truth value. So there are not only natural concepts, right? There are also abstract concepts, ideas that are nonetheless true. So if I said that somebody is beautiful, for instance, that's an abstract concept. It's not tangible. You can't touch it. You can't feel it. You can't taste it. But it is a statement that has truth value for nonetheless. For somebody can be objectively beautiful. You cannot verify by science. You can't verify by science whether Jesus would have been a guard in one of the concentration camps, right, in Germany or in Buchenwald or Auschwitz. Or you can't even tell by science whether it was good that the Holocaust happened or it was bad that the Holocaust happened. Such dimensions are they are far removed from science. So I think you can see the logical incoherency in stating that science is the only means by which we can come to knowledge. Now, why did I say this? I'm saying this because if we are to inquire whether or not God exists, science suffers as a limitation, right? It suffers a limitation as a correct epistemology by which we can ground the knowledge of God. Epistemology, just in case you hear me say it, is just a fancy word for how we come to know our beliefs are true. Next slide. Like Carlo Rovelli, who is also a physicist, would say, philosophers have tools and skills that physics needs, but do not belong to the physicist training. Conceptual analysis, attention to ambiguity, accuracy of expression, the ability to detect gaps in standard arguments, to devise radically new perspectives, to spot conceptual weak points, and to seek out alternative conceptual explanations all belong to the realm of philosophy. You can't do that by science. And you have not only Carlo Rovelli admitting to this statement, you have multiple philosophers in academia also saying that there is no way that physics could ground itself, or even the scientific method itself has philosophical premises. For it is by philosophy, you say, that we come to ground some of the things we deem as scientific facts through observation, hypothesis, and the rest. So I did this to demonstrate that if God does exist, it will be a categorical error to say that we can know God solely through science. For that would be to say that you can put God in a lab and test him. Next slide. So I am going to be using arguments to argue for God's existence. There are many arguments. There are inductive arguments, there are abductive arguments, there are deductive arguments. But for the sake of this presentation and for time, I'll be using the deductive argument or a deductive argument. So an argument is simply, by its most basic definition, where you have two premises that logically follow to a conclusion. You have a set of premises and it leads to a conclusion. Now, the first one would be, an example would be premise 1. No material body propagates faster than light. It means no material body travels faster than light. Premise 2, my SUV or my car or my salon is a material body. Then conclusion, my SUV does not propagate faster than light. The first two premises are valid. And if they are valid, then the conclusion logically follows, right? Or another example would be premise 1, all living organisms reproduce. Premise 2, human beings are living organisms. Conclusion, therefore, would be that human beings can reproduce. Again, if the premises follow, then the conclusion logically follows. But let's say I try to argue, I make another deductive argument for God, and then the first premise says that if God exists, miracles are possible. Premise 2, God exists. Then conclusion, miracles are possible. Now, this logically follows, but one can argue that it's one thing for an argument to logically follow. It's another thing for an argument to be sound. For the premises can follow and lead to the conclusion, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the premises itself are always sound. So for instance, if you are an atheist, or this is an axiom that we share with Christians. If you're a Christian here, you have no problem agreeing that, of course, logically, if God exists, then miracles are possible. But if you are an atheist or a naturalist or any non-Christian who doesn't share my axioms, you would contend premise 1 and you would even contend premise 2. And so that is why I cannot convince you with this deductive argument. Because if I assume premise 2 that God exists, all it means is that I'm begging the question. I'm unable to demonstrate matter of fact that God exists. So what I will then do is employ an argument to demonstrate that fact that God indeed does exist. Now, there are multiple arguments that you can use. There's the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the ontological argument propounded by Saint Anselm in the 11th century. There's a modal ontological argument propounded by Plantinga. And then there's also the argument from desire propounded by C.S. Lewis, of whom other 20th century philosophers will work on this argument and then propound it. And you see it in the works of Peter van Inwagen and Plantinga. Now, the one that I'm going to draw from all these arguments, because of what I deem to be his efficacy, is the cosmological argument. Now, even under the cosmological arguments, there are subcategories of arguments. Now, Thomism from Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways, right? Where he argues that there has to be a first mover that puts things into motion. And from everything that moves, you can always take it back to a first mover, an unmoved mover, right? And then there's also the Kalam cosmological theory, which was first propounded by John Philoponus in his Against Proclus on the Eternity of the World. Now, it's its most basic form, but people like the Mutakalimun, which were Muslim medieval scholastics, would expound on these arguments and, solidify it more. And then we have people like R.L. Sturch in 1970 and William Lane Craig, some of whom we might be familiar with, in 1979, popularizing this argument. Now, there's a difference between popularizing an argument and propounding the argument. And one cosmological argument, lastly, is the contingency argument, propounded by the German logician and mathematician Gottfried Leibniz. That's the one I'm going to be employing to demonstrate an argument for God. So, the premise or the foundation that the cosmological argument of contingency lies on. Next slide. Next slide is, once you see that I exhaust this, just, move to the next one. Thank you. So is the principle of sufficient reason. What does principle of sufficient reason say? The principle of sufficient reason says that all contingent facts must have explanations in and of themselves. It is essential to the claim that every true contingent proposition must have an explanation. What it means is that as Leibniz would say, that every physical thing is a monad. I am a monad. PSAM is a monad. This stand is a monad. This laptop is a monad, right? Everything, the phone here is a monad. And every monad is contingent because we can think of a state of affairs where monads do not exist. Just like I can think of a state of affairs where this PC does not exist, or I can think of a state of affairs where Mo does not exist. And by the virtue of that nature, it makes me contingent. It means I am dependent on something to subsist, to exist. So that's the principle of sufficient reason, that every monad has in of itself a sufficient reason for its explanation. And this sufficient reason would have to exist external to itself, right? Are we following? It has to be external to itself. So it says here that it is evident fact of reality that variety of different things exist. Nobody denies this. Neither can it be denied. For you would have to not exist. For you exist to deny it, and to exist to then deny it will be, again, self-stultifying. Do you follow? So this is a self-evident fact. And it is ordered from very large things like planets, stars, and passing through to more medium-sized things than flamingos, humans, and buildings, to very small things like quarks, protons, and neutrons. We know that quarks, protons, and neutrons subsist in flamingos, human beings, and galaxies. And flamingos, human beings, subsist in planets, stars, and galaxies. And planets, stars, and galaxies subsist in other larger physical matter. I'm sure you get the idea by now. So the next slide will be, it's a diagram, like a schematic that explains. So every single box that you see there represents a monad. Again, monads are me, the PC, the floor, anything, right? It represents a monad. Now, you can see in the monads that there is a property within any monad that connects it in a vast network of explanation, right? Or the reason why an ice sculpture subsists is why. Why does an ice sculpture subsist? It's because of the external atmosphere, right? Right? Okay, yeah. It's because of the external atmosphere. For if you were not below 0 degrees, it will not subsist or be self-sustained, or be sustained, I beg your pardon. But what is the reason for the whole set of monads? What explains the existence and the nature of the universe itself? Or as Richard Swinburne put it, who's a 20th century philosopher, he said that what explains the physical matter in which all physical matters are entailed. So the fact that this needs explanation doesn't mean that the universe itself would not need an explanation. For the universe itself is a physical property, which is why Alexander Proust would say that it would be a philosophical mistake to leave PSR to purely theological uses. Philosophy starts in wonder, and wonder impels us to find reason for things. So here's the contingency argument I'll be arguing for. So the first one is that there are dependent beings. We've already argued that there are dependent beings. We are all dependent on something to exist. We're all dependent in a vast network of biological processes for us to subsist. Now, having got that out of the way, it takes us to premise 2. Keep in mind that I said that if all the premises follow, then the conclusion logically follows. If there are dependent beings, then their existence must be continually sustained by something else, right? And if this is true, it means that the universe itself would need an explanation. And the universe itself cannot terminate in itself as a cause for its own explanation. That would not make sense. It would be like saying that the universe caused itself, for the universe would have to exist to cause itself. And if the universe exists to cause itself, it only possesses the set of explanation for that. So what explains the universe? Apart from the fact that that doesn't make sense to say that the universe would have to exist to cause itself, right? And so in an endless chain of dependent beings would have to terminate at something that is necessary, something itself that is not contingent. For to say that a chain of dependent beings or a chain of monads or a chain of contingent beings cannot terminate at a necessary being would lead us to an infinite regress. So it means that if we were to say, okay, what caused the world to exist? Then when people say God, for instance, or when theists say God, people try to say, okay, what is the explanation for God himself? But that doesn't take away the problem. For if you ask what explains God, you would also have to ask what explains God. And then you have to ask what explains God, what explains God. And then you have to go ad infinitum, right? So if I started saying what explains God about 150 million times raised to the 150 millionth power, we still would not terminate as a necessary being. So that would lead us to an infinite regress. And an infinite regress is philosophically incoherent, right? For an actual set of dependent beings cannot subsist. That would be nonsensical. So it would mean that this would have to terminate at a necessary being. And even atheistic philosophers like Michael Ruse or J.H. Sobel would agree that the concept of an infinite regress is incoherent. Therefore, you cannot have, an unending chain of dependent beings, which will lead us to premise 3, that if dependent beings are continually sustained, the chain of continually sustained dependent being regresses infinitely or terminates at a necessary cause. We've already explained why it must terminate as a necessary cause. Then 4, the chain of sustained dependent beings cannot regress infinitely. Then it logically follows to the conclusion that therefore, that's a typo there. Therefore, the chain of continually sustained dependent beings must terminate in a necessary being that itself is not caused. And the Big Bang cosmology proves this, right? We've seen evidence from an expanding universe from Georges Lemaitre, who propounded the hypothesis of the primeval atom, or Edwin Hubble, whose observation of space noticed the redshift, which seems to suggest that a space that has been expanding on time, right? There would be a time where the space, there had an initial condition from which it expanded. So think of me blowing into a balloon, for instance, that's expanding, right? Or, blowing helium into a balloon. Now, if I stop blowing, it would what? It would contract, right? Into a moment where you have an initial condition, a Planck scale where space, time, and matter itself do not subsist. And so what the Big Bang theory, especially through the Bode-Good-Vilenkin theorem, shows us is that the universe on an average has been expanding throughout its history. And a universe that's been expanding cannot be infinite in the past, but must have its past space-time boundary, according to the second law of thermodynamics. I think all of this is just to say that the universe at some point began to exist, and this is demonstrated by Big Bang cosmology. Now, I once heard somebody say that naturalism or atheism is the orthodoxy of the scientific community, right? It means that as much as I have presuppositions that God exists, there are those who also are committed to the claim or to the idea that God does not exist. And there are many in the scientific community who did not want the Big Bang to be true when it was propounded. So, for instance, the brilliant astrophysicist Richard Lewontin, who says that it is not, now I'd like us to pay attention here, for what he says here is salient. He says, it is not the methods and the institution of science that somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. Now, that's telling when he says that it is not the method or the institution of science. For science itself can only describe facts about the natural world. It does not prescribe facts about the natural world. But after having admitted that, he says, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations. No matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated, moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Or Alan McRoberts in his Beyond the Big Bang piece that he wrote for Sky and Telescope in 1983, where he said that the idea of an oscillating universe in which the Big Bang resulted from a recollapse of a previous state of the universe gained currency merely because he avoided the issue of creation, not because he had the slightest of evidence for it. Or even I.L. Rottenzel, where he says that the only way to account for all these facts in the framework of physical concepts without invoking a metaphysical power is to admit the existence of a number of universes. So in other words, a universe or an explanation or a hypothesis of multiverses is more rational and is more consistent than the hypothesis simply that God exists. Now, this demonstrates the pre-commitments that even brilliant men have, as we've quoted from even Bertrand Russell. There are people who are committed, despite the evidence, to commit themselves to the proposition that God does not exist. And this will take us to the next slide, right? So as we explained from the contingency argument, so S would mean a state of affairs. So for instance, a state of affairs is simply that you are sitting here in this hall and listening to me speak to you is a state of affairs. That maybe it might be raining currently is a state of affairs. That is the state of affairs, right? So in the scientific state of affairs or in the stages of cosmic evolution, S would equal the state of affairs. L atop the S would simply mean law, right? So from state of affairs 1, there is a law that explains when you conjunct state of affairs 2 and the law, it explains state of affairs 1, right? So what explains, what example can I use? So what explains that a body or an object is being displaced by water and one is submerged under the water? That would be the Archimedes principle, right? So the Archimedes principle would be state of affairs. State of affairs 1 would be the submergence of water. Archimedes principle would be the law, right? And then state of affairs 2 would also be fluid mechanics, for it is fluid mechanics that explains to us how that happens. And then what is the law that explains state of affairs 2? That would be the law of motion, right? And so on and so forth until it leads us back to the initial condition, that is before space, time, and matter began to subsist. Next slide. So the initial condition would equal SF, right? That's the initial condition before space, time, and matter began to exist. So something, as we have seen that laws have to explain the state of affairs, something also has to explain SF before time, space, and matter began. Now, there are only 2 alternative explanations. 1, either the initial conditions spontaneously generated without cause, which is priority monism, or state of affairs has a personal cause, which is theism, right? Now, you only need to look at the 2 options. You can't have any other option. It's either the universe itself spontaneously generated without cause, or the initial conditions of the universe has a personal cause to it. Now, you'd have to ask which one logically sounds, which one sounds more rationally consistent. Now, there have been arguments for the universe being without cause, but there have also been arguments for a personal cause. But I guess ultimately you then have to ask yourself which one sounds more rationally consistent, that something out of nothing, could just generate itself in a complex and vast network of explanation that you call the universe, right? For we know that nothing comes out of nothing. For out of nothing, nothing comes. That would be saying like 0 times 0 would equals 1. out of nothing, nothing comes. But it makes more rational sense to say that the initial conditions has a personal cause that cause it to subsist, as we have seen from the contingency argument. Now, in science, there's something we call the inference to the best explanation. Now, the inference to the best explanation, as the word implies, is, okay, what is the perfect hypothesis that explains a state of affairs better? Now, to the previous slide, remember we said that we have spontaneously generated without cause, and then the second one is that this initial condition has a personal cause. So which hypothesis would best explain the initial conditions? Next slide. And so that would be, that's the point of the inference to the best explanation. Like, what's the best explanation for the state of affairs? Premise one would be, X would be the state of affairs, body of facts or observation. What's the state of affairs? The universe, right? That's the state of affairs. Premise two, Q would, if true, explain S. So the first proposition, if true, would explain S. Or the second proposition, if true, would also explain X. Premise three, no other hypothesis can explain X as well as Q does. Therefore, with high probability, Q is true. So I'm going to ask that in the first proposition and the second alternative, which one do you think makes more sense? That a universe can subsist and begin to exist uncaused, or just like I might close my laptop in the same way that the universe by an external cause might come to subsist? Which one makes more rational sense? It would be the latter, that there is an external cause that acts upon an object for it to succeed. So when you use inference to the best, now I'm saying this because there have been multiple books and papers published to the effects arguing for and against theism. But all of this collapses into the inference to the best explanation. It is that at the end of the day, which one explains the universe better? And from the contingency argument, it can follow that it is God himself that causes the universe to exist, that explains all the laws of nature and the state of affairs. Just like Joshua Sijuade said, and he's a Nigerian philosopher at the London School of Theology, where he says, theism, which is a candidate personal fundamental explanation. He says that we have a theologically based explanation that supports a view that the fundamental layer of reality and the terminus in explanation for everything above or below it is of a non-physical nature. So it logically follows that whatsoever it is that would be the cause of this would be non-physical as well, would be non-physical. In short, everything bottoms out at the feet of a non-physical fundamental entity. And this fundamental entity, I would argue, is God. And by the nature of this cause, we can see that he would have to be eternal, right? For he caused time, space, and matter to exist. And if he causes time, space, and matter to exist, it means he lives outside of time, space, and matter. And he would also have to possess incorporeality. It means he would not have a body like me and you, right? He would also have to be one. For we cannot have two necessary beings. We can only have one terminus that explains the chain of dependent beings or dependent monads. And then there would also be power because he causes this universe to exist. I think I can even sneak in omnipotence there, so long as we're defining omnipotence as the ability to do that which is logically possible. And then I would also add volition as well. For it is something that has a mind or a will that can cause something like this to exist. Now, I can say volition is into two, right? There are two categories of volition. Appetitive volition, that is the volition that causes me to eat, and it also accrues to animals as well, because what motivates the animal to eat is simply its desire to eat. In the same way, what motivates a newly hatched snake to swallow a gecko is simply that desire, that killer instinct in it, right? So that's an appetitive volition. But there is also a volition that is of the will to spend time composing this, spend time contemplating on the arguments and putting them in a coherent format. And you know that would take, of course, somebody who is rational, a rational soul, to do this. But as complex as this might be, this is not a comment that this is very complex. I'm saying the ability to put things in a coherent manner is complex, and that cannot be ascribed to an appetitive volition. And we see the universe that it is exponentially vast, unimaginably vast, and it is fine-tuned rightly for life. That such that if the initial conditions were moved just a bit, and the calculations just have to be precise, for life would not subsist if any of those things were not appropriately calculated into an astronomical level. And you would see that this thing would have to have a will. And if it has a will, it follows that it is personal, right? And if it is personal, and we as human beings also have a personality, we have a will, we can think, we're rational, then it follows that God too is rational, he can think, because God himself cannot give unto his creations properties that he does not possess, right? It follows that God is, if we cannot, the act of rationality, of intellect, of having a will, would not subsist if God himself did not have an intellect and a will. So that's the contingency argument, basically, and it follows that God exists. So to answer the question, does God exist? Yes, as the contingency argument has argued. So yeah, the recommended titles would be Alexander Proust and Joshua Rasmussen, Necessary Existence, Immanuel Rotten, Towards a Renewed Case for Theism, and then the Cosmological Argument by Jason Waller. Now, what Jason Waller does here in this book is that he criticizes both sides of the conversation. So he says, well, the arguments for God's existence using the cosmological arguments aren't really successful, but the arguments also used against God's existence are not really successful. So what does he conclude at the end of the day? Even he concludes that what makes more rational sense is that even if we are not going to say that the Christian God exists, at least something that is godlike, a godlike thing. That's literally what he calls it. A godlike thing exists. So does God exist? According to the contingency arguments, yes. Thank you.